All right, so what we want to get to is we'll find equilibrium, and what we're looking for is what's called consumative surplus and producer surplus. So in a competitive, and we're going to keep it competitive and small, in a competitive and small economy, the total amount that the consumers are actually willing to spend is usually less than the amount they are willing to spend, right? Sometimes you go and you buy an item, right, and you would have been actually willing to pay a little more for it than what maybe the store provider has set for you. And so again, you're kind of a little bit happy. All right, I would have been willing to pay more, but I'm okay at this price. Right? That amount you would have been willing to pay more is what's called the consumer surplus, which I'm going to label capital CS. So when you see capital CS, that's instead of writing out the word consumer surplus, that's what it means. All right, so where the formula comes from, it actually has to do with a little bit with area under the curve and that equilibrium point. All right, so consumer surplus is the total amount consumers, the people who demand the item, were willing to spend minus the actual amount they spent. Right, the actual amount that they spent, which would be the revenue generated. All right, so graphically, it involves the demand function. All right, the price demand function, where my demand is equal to the price, X is the number of items that they'll sell at that price. So using my previous example, remember, and we're just going to look at the demand equation. So remember, the demand equation was 800. So X was the office desk. And remember, the equilibrium point was 20 and 700. And I'm going to draw that in my picture. All right, so I'm going to sketch a graph of just the demand function. So remember, the demand function was... All right, so this was X, which was my office desks. This was price in dollars. And when they set their price to 800, 0 desks will be sold. And then remember, it's a line, and 800 is a lot bigger than the negative 5. So it's a line that's moving down, but it's not moving down particularly fast. So there's my demand, which was the 800 minus 5x. Then the equilibrium point was 2,700. That was my equilibrium point that I gave you in the last one, when supply equals demand. That was when supply equals demand. And so I'm going to go ahead and mark it off. My equilibrium number of office desks was 20. My equilibrium price was 700. So when they set their price to $700 per desk, in this small market, small competitive market, they would expect to sell 20 of them. All right, that's the demand. The demand would be 20. All right. And so this is my demand function. And what we're looking for, or what we would need you to sort of understand, is I put these dotted lines here. This box represents the revenue, which is price at equilibrium times quantity at equilibrium, right? That's the area of a rectangle is length times width. Well, length would be 20, right? This distance is 20, and length would be 700, right? This is 20, and this is 700. 20 and 700. And so the revenue generated from the sale of the 20 items that they sold would be $14,000, right? You take 700 times 20, right? You sell 20 desks for $700 a piece, right? Revenue is the net proceeds from your sales. And so that box represents revenue. All right, that's the amount of revenue generated at the equilibrium point. Right? That's the amount of money spent by the consumers when they bought the 20 desks at $700 a piece. What we're looking for is the extra that they didn't spend. Right? The consumer surplus, what they would have been willing to spend more of. The higher price, lower demand items. That's this area here above the rectangle. In this case, it would be a triangle. But that's this yellow area here. This yellow area would be the surplus. This is the consumer surplus. This is the extra. All right, that area here would be the this part would be the difference between the total amount they were willing to spend minus the actual amount they spent. All right? And so how we find that? Well, the total amount they would have been spending would have been the total sum of the demand to the equilibrium point. And so how we find that, all right, how we find the formula for the consumer demand is the area under the curve, right? I only want the yellow area. But remember, an integration would find, so let me do a different color. If I found this total area here, right, all the way up here, right, total area, well, that total area, this gray area, would be equal to the integration from 0 to 20, right, so my x term, of my demand function. Now, that's not the area I want. This is actually the amount they would have been willing to spend, right, up to the equilibrium point. That would be the sum of all of the demands from 0 to the equilibrium point. It would be all the amount they would have been willing to spend. The amount they actually spent was the rectangular area, right? That was the amount they actually spent, this rectangular area here. The extra that they didn't spend was the yellow above. And so how you figure out that is you find the total area under the demand curve, integrate the demand curve up to the equilibrium point, subtract the revenue, the amount they actually spent, and that difference is the extra, the surplus. And so the consumer surplus is equal to the integration from 0 to my equilibrium point of my demand function minus the revenue generated. Well, the revenue generated would be the price at equilibrium times the quantity at equilibrium. And so for this, so that would be the equation in general. So this particular example, it would be 0 to 20 of my demand, 800 minus 5x dx, minus the 20 times 700, the equilibrium price and demand. And then you'd solve that. You'd integrate that. And so this integration, I'm just going to give it to you. You can solve it on your own, and you can check my answer if you want to. If you integrate this, it comes out to 15,000. This is 14,000. And so the difference is $1,000. And so the consumer surplus was $1,000. That would be this yellow area. This yellow area was 1,000 units. In this case, the units are dollars. So that's the amount they didn't spend. They would have been willing to spend that extra 1,000, the consumers, the buyers, but they didn't have to. They only spent 14,000. All right, and so that would be the consumer surplus. And so that's the formula. It's the area under the demand curve up to the equilibrium point. It's the total amount they would have spent. They actually spent the rectangular area, the revenue generated at the equilibrium. The difference is the surplus, the consumer surplus, which again I label capital S, capital CS. All right, we'll do producer surplus in the next video.